Hello, everyone. Harjo, and welcome to tonight's event. This is session 4 of Indigenous Women, Artists and Activists. I'm Renee Goki, the Teacher Services Coordinator at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. I'm really pleased to be with you, and I'll be facilitating today's workshop. During this 4-part teacher workshop series, you'll be introduced to the intersection of Indigenous women, artists, and activism. Today, Poet Laureate Day will share thinking exercises and strategies that connect us to poetry, available on the Library of Congress's website, Living Nations, Living Words, and her own poetry. So we're in for a treat this evening. And as well, at the Library of Congress's website, there are many other poets that are featured, so she'll share that with us. The project was spearheaded by current U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, who's a citizen of the Muskogee, also known as the Creek Nation, and will use the museum's Essential Understandings Framework and Poetry by Contemporary Indigenous Artists to examine ways that we might use poetry to connect with Indigenous ways of learning and knowing, and also connect it to our own lives and the lives of our students and their experiences. So as with our in-person programs, we generally start with a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands that we live, work, and play on, that we gather here from our respective homes this evening, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. So this is the museum's land acknowledgement, and it is, general in the sense that, we are contemporary people and there's Indigenous people from all over the United States and beyond that live and make their homes in Washington, D.C. area. But in all of our places, it's also important to acknowledge that the ancestral people who have cared for these homes for millennia, the languages and all of the traditions that are steeped to those lands and to those traditions, the descendants of those people are still here. And so you see here a picture of Chief Billy Redwing Tyak, who was Piscataway, pictured with his son Mark at the groundbreaking ceremony for the museum on the mall. Land acknowledgements are, they're really a first step in acknowledging Indigenous people, and we have some guidance if that is something that is new to you. We have some resources in the chat for you that are available. And so good to see so many of you here. As I mentioned, belonging is deeply tied to the land for Indigenous people. And it's really, this idea of belonging extends to all of us, belonging to our families, our communities, maybe the land itself or the waters that surround us. It's even woven in for many Indigenous people into our languages themselves. I also want to mention, I think it's important to note that thousands of Native people were forcibly removed from their homelands, their ancestral lands in the United States in forced removals. And some people would use the term ethnic cleansing, including the community that Laura Day, the presenter for this evening, and my community, my people, the Shawnee. So I think it's important to note that, and Laura has some wonderful resources I encourage you to explore that are online, in which she talks about language and land and things like that. So I think that's really important to note too. And I want to take just a moment to share a traditional greeting in the Shawnee language, and it is Haku Wisila Samamo, and that means, how are you breathing? And Laura and I had a fun conversation about this because we both are learning Shawnee language online. And I had always at least thought that it was kind of meant, how are you doing? And I think that really speaks to the wisdom and ideas of health and wellness that are prevalent and embedded in Indigenous languages. So that is a really important way to acknowledge that knowledge, that intellect, and a worldview that our people seek to regain too. All right, so So there are some resources in the chat there. And on the next slide, I wanted to show you a little bit about the context of the National Museum of the American Indian, where many of us who are helping support tonight's program work. So on the left, you see our facility in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. In the center, you see our facility in New York City, a fantastic exhibition space and some really great programming that is in Lower Manhattan, and some really dynamic, a really dynamic new and relevant exhibition about Native New York. So I invite you to explore that and the related lessons online. And finally, the heart of our museum is our Cultural Resources Center, which is in Suitland, Maryland. And this is a place that we store and steward the cultural objects, the 800,000 plus cultural objects and contemporary art that's in our care. So next, this is the vision and mission of our museum. And I'd like to focus just on the vision statement because this is fairly new for us and it is, a work in progress, I will say. It says that equity and social justice for the Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere through education, inspiration, and empowerment. So we are working, I think, in the realm I work in education, we are working to disrupt narratives that render Native people invisible and really seek to tell more complete narratives that you can add in your classroom. So we really see you teachers as our allies and our, I guess our friends in this work. And so we really appreciate all that you do. And through Native Knowledge 360, which is our national education initiative, we really seek to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans. So we do this through providing professional developments like the one that you've joined this evening. We do this through guidance, whether it's short format, helpful handouts, or full lesson plans and modules that are available on our website. We have student websites, things are bilingual. We have many resources that are bilingual, because what I didn't say is that a lot of times we talk about the National Education Initiative in terms of the United States, but really our collection is hemispheric. The partnerships that we have with Indigenous people extends throughout the Americas, and our resources also follow that. So we have many resources that tell more complete narratives about our brothers and sisters in Central and South America and the Caribbean islands. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're hoping to do tonight. This session seeks to connect you to Native Knowledge 360 through our collections that are cared for in our museum, our essential understandings framework, and some approaches that we hope you can use in your classroom. So some really hopefully some nice entry points into this topic. So next, I'll just tell you a little bit more about our objectives. So we'll explore ways that Indigenous women, and tonight, Laureate, so through poetry, she shares her message to inspire inquiry, conversation, and action. And we hope to always do a good job of connecting past with present. And I think that contemporary piece is just so important in your classrooms when teaching about Native Americans. Second, we'll model some short inquiry and thinking strategies, and Laura will share some writing and thinking prompts to connect to the themes presented, and consider ways to share the approaches or content in ways that are, I think, naturally relevant and meaningful to your students because they're very universal. And finally, we hope that you'll take action to support young people that you work with in finding their voice through thoughtful thinking, writing, and poetry, and connect to other Indigenous poetry and poets. So this is the essential understandings framework that I had mentioned earlier. And this follows the 10 themes for the National Council for the Social Studies. So for example, the first theme in social studies is culture. And so what we've done is we've developed both essential understandings, language that will help you frame your thinking and teaching about Native people that you could use in your classroom directly with your students, or maybe to frame a lesson. Most of our lessons since this has been developed, every lesson ties to these essential, a select few of essential understandings. And then we've developed some key concepts under those 10 themes for the Council for the Social Studies. So, for example, in essential understanding number 3, the theme is around people, places, and environments. So we crafted language such as, for thousands of years, Indigenous people have studied, managed, honored, and thrived in their homelands. These foundations continue to influence American Indian relationships and interactions with the land today. So that is the essential understanding that was developed. And then from that, we pulled 2 key concepts that I think are relevant to tonight's discussion, and actually that Laura helped to select as well. She selected this essential understanding. So the story of American Indians in the Western Hemisphere is intricately intertwined with places and environments. Native knowledge systems resulted from long-term occupation of tribal homelands and observation and interaction with place. American Indians understood and valued the relationship between local environments and cultural traditions, and recognized that human beings are part of the environment. So that's one key concept that I just hope to share with you tonight to sort of frame our thinking for the evening. Again, these are not, I don't think I said that the essential understandings are really a framework, not necessarily a curriculum. So I'd like to pull open the chat here and hear a little bit more from you. What types of thinking do you hope to do today? So just take a moment. Thank you for sharing. I'm always jot notes down. Dreaming. Open-minded. Creative ideas for Poetry Month. Ideas to get students to be creative and seeing collaborative, critical thinking. Launching point for Poetry Month, yes, in April. Authentic and meaningful resources. You want to hear about current Indigenous writers, connect to different poetic forms. Collaborative, I've seen several times. That's great. These are great ideas. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah. And I'm almost, hoping to slow down a little bit and think more carefully about what I'm saying. Showing the universality, I think, of beauty and culture, intercultural understandings, authentic voices in the classroom, bringing those in. These are great. Thank you so much for sharing. These are really great ideas. And Laura had framed this earlier. I really liked her question about, thinking about what types of, before you enter into a lesson or an exercise, thinking about the types of thinking you want your students to do. So I thought it would be fun to open up with that. So today we're going to be working with poet Laura Day, as I've said, about ways to catalyze conversations around Indigenous activism and increase awareness of issues that are important to Indigenous people. Let's take a look at an object from our Shawnee culture, our shared Shawnee culture, that is in the museum's collection. It's a bag, and we'll do a thinking routine this evening. Some of you who've been with us in this series are familiar with See, Think, Wonder. It's from Harvard's Project Zero. And we've kind of adapted it a little bit at NMAI, and we have developed a worksheet that uses that as a catalyst, but we've added like a little sketching activity and things. So that will be in the chat for you as well. And I see Bert has linked the See, Think, Wonder thinking routine. Well, that will be sent out as well. So all of these things, will be sent, as I said, afterwards, but also the NK 360 worksheet is on our website. So that'll be available as well. So let's start. Please use the chat to very simply just describe what you see when you look at this object. Hopefully you can see it well. You may have to lean in a little. And while you're doing that and just describing what you see, I'll tell you a little bit about the routine and what it seeks to do, what it sort of accomplishes with your students. This routine encourages different types of thinking. In particular, students are asked to make careful observations and describe what they see, which can be hard. Sometimes we want to jump ahead in our thinking. So this is a great routine to start with because it asks us to demonstrate skills that we already know, and the same with our students. It's widely accessible to many different types of learners. And so that's why it's a really good starting place. So I'm seeing, reminds me of an Ojibwe bandolier bag. And I know there were some, I saw colors earlier. Yeah, really specific: blue, yellow, red, flowers, question mark. Cool colors and designs. Repetition. Yeah, this is great. This is really good. Thank you for sharing. Color really jumped out for the first time that I saw this bag as well. It really jumped out at me. So now what I'd like you to do is, in the second part, I'd like you to list in the chat what you think about what you see. So please use language in the chat to connect what you observed, what you saw, to why you think what you do. So, you know, this part of the routine really uses reasoning skills and ask for evidence. And we also have the luxury here of having the, similar to in an exhibition, seeing the label for the bag. So while the rich color drew me in initially, I started to look more closely at the label, and I saw that it was Shawnee, and I noticed the date and the location. So this was a time, you know, it says Ohio River Valley circa 1830. So about 1830, but you know, the Shawnee, we had reservations in Ohio, and we, around 1832, there were different cities, villages of Shawnee people, and we were removed at various times, different groups of Shawnee from different reservations. So our people were moved in 1832, and different Shawnee groups, again, were kind of moved around that time as well. So, you know, it brought up a lot for me, and it really drew me into the bag, because then I had, you know, some more questions about it, because I recognized that this was a very pivotal time for the Shawnee, and a very disruptive time. So this is the part we kind of added in, and I really like what I'm seeing about that someone took their time, they created this purposefully, and that it's intricate and well planned with nice materials. It was saved, so it must be precious. Yeah. So we saw, you know, we've seen repetition, we've seen care with this bag, we've seen thoughtful planning and design that it takes to create something like this, and that it, you know, that must be precious to the people. Yeah. So the third part of this that we kind of added in was to try and connect it to your life and personal experience. So, you know, that's on the worksheet, but for me, this bag, like I said before, really marks a huge connection. When I saw it for the first time, it was actually in New York City. I admired the patterns, but since I'm a plant lover, I was really drawn in to the plants, and I started to look at those in more detail because I have a love of plants and trees and things like that. So what do you wonder? Bert's put that in the chat for us. What do you wonder about this bag? And this part of the routine helps to stimulate curiosity, and it sets the stage for further inquiry. It also lays a path forward for with the idea that learning is not about necessarily an ending point or arriving at a place where you have all of your questions answered, but instead sort of sparks and inspires asking more questions and deepening our thinking about the bag. Wonder what it was meant to carry. Did both men and women use it? Yeah. Yep. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of really, deeper questions. Yeah, and I won't be able to add, have the time to answer all of these questions. I have answered to some of these questions, but I think that this is the whole point, is to really spark a lot of inquiry. This particular bag, it actually, to my knowledge, a lot of these bags that have been called in some circles bandolier bags, and in other places, amongst beaters, they call them bandolier bags. And other places, the movement's more towards shoulder bags. So there's different ways that people call these bags, but they were often very revered. And in some tribal communities, it was a sign of diplomacy that you would wear, a bag over each shoulder for very, for the leaders in the community. And if they were talking amongst other nations or at treaty signings and things like that, these types of bags would be worn. Often they don't carry, and I can't speak for all the bags, but I think that some of these bags, they actually don't carry anything. So the pocket is actually sewn shut. And I think there are more symbols of authority and the kind of esteem that you have to speak on behalf of your people as a diplomat. And I don't know about this particular bag, if that's the story, but that is the story of some of these bags. So it really gets us thinking more. And certainly a lot of women would probably make the bags. So I looked more closely at the specific designs, and, as I leaned into the bag when I saw it in person, I noticed the blue leaves at the bottom of the bag and inside the red, the part that would hold something if there was an actual, pocket there. And I noticed that it's a distinct leaf. It's the leaf of the sassafras, and it has a distinctive leaf because the first lobes of the plant, they have one lobe, and then the second, as the tree grows, then there's two lobes, and finally there's three lobes. So we see the 2 and the 3 lobes. And so I realized, oh, that's the sassafras, or Pakwani Mishi, as we say in Shawnee. And to me, that was really significant and personal, because I've been taught in my family just about the sassafras, and we use it still today. And we even went out, to Oklahoma on several occasions and gathered it as a family on my grandmother's allotment land. So it was just a really nice connection, just by leaning in to the bag and looking more closely at it. So I wanted to share that with you. And it's really nice because just this week I've been going back, because it's spring, to drinking the sassafras tea with my children. And so it's a really nice way to connect to my grandmother and my Shawnee family on that side, and our long history too. It connects us to our history and our relationship with the land. So that bag has many stories. So now I'd like to introduce poet, teacher, and activist Laura Day. She is a lifelong resident of the Pacific Northwest and studied creative writing at the Institute of American Indian Arts and at the University of Washington, 2 great schools. Her first book, Tributaries, was published by the University of Arizona Press, and it won a 2016 American Book Award. So that's really exciting. She has subsequent books as well. She is a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, as I have mentioned. And I just want to point out, teachers, if maybe you're joining us for the first time, that when we introduce a guest presenter, we often include the tribal flag. And that is just a nod to the fact that federally recognized tribes in the United States today are sovereign nations. And so, that's why I use the word citizenship as well. So that's just a really nice way to introduce, because students recognize flags as symbols of sovereignty, of nationhood. That's just a really nice, easy way to consider in your own classroom when you bring Indigenous voices in. So we'll include the Eastern Shawnee Nation website in the chat. And we'll also include a Native Knowledge 360 lesson that Bert's just put in there for us. It's called, it's a case study of the removal of the Shawnee Nation. Just one story amongst many, but it's there if that's something that you teach in your classroom. So I mentioned that Laura is from the Pacific Northwest, and this is a story that we share. Many Eastern Shawnee families moved around the time of the Great Depression out to California, Oregon, and Washington for work. And so, that's just kind of a nice connection that I think we have. And tonight she will be introducing us to her poetry and share strategies to help us think more deeply about Indigenous perspectives and land-based poetry as activism. She's an incredible poet and a very warm and generous person. And I'm absolutely honored to have her here and sharing with you. So Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Yahweh Renee for that very gracious introduction. Hato, hoesipukonya, Laura de Netesito. Welcome everyone. I hope that you are comfortable where you are. I'm so looking forward to getting the chance to talk about poetry, about Indigenous literature, and about connecting to place and land as a strategy. I am a poet, but I also taught public school for almost 20 years. So this really brings a lot of my passions and perspectives together. And I want to talk just briefly about the connection between things. So I so appreciate that Renee shared the Shawnee shoulder bag, because I come from a tradition, sort of a female tradition of beading. And there's a little bit of a joke in my family that had I been more patient and skilled, I would be a beader, not a poet. But I take a lot of that metaphor of beading into poetry, because I think they share certain commonalities around the condension of image and the way that beading pattern is passed through generations, where beaders will adapt and give their own style, but kind of continue an aesthetic tradition. And finally, just as we saw that beading creates this incredibly beautiful artifact of time and place that's sort of wrought with symbolism. So to me, it's a beautiful connection to the way poetry can function in the world and in the classroom. I also really appreciate that highlighting of the way that land is embedded within the story of an artifact. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that land is embedded into poetry and how bringing that perspective into the classroom can create a really rich opportunity for students to engage with Indigenous poetry and to write and to understand and talk in ways that are connected to the land that they are learning on. So to begin, I'm going to read one of my poems, and we're actually going to use this poem to model a strategy that I hope folks can take into their learning spaces. And this is a poem that I wrote when I was still teaching middle school. And it's a poem for me that combines language and place, and the way that language and place can come together to tell a story of history and also to obscure a perspective of history. This poem will be made available to you as well so that you can utilize it, reread it, whatever you'd like to do. This poem is called Passive Voice. I use a trick to teach students how to avoid passive voice. Circle the words. Imagine inserting by zombies after each one. Have the words been claimed by the flesh-hungry undead? If so, passive voice. I wonder if these sixth graders will recollect on summer vacation as they stretch their legs on the way home from Yellowstone or Yosemite, and the byway's historical marker beckons them to the site of an Indian village where trouble was brewing, where after further hostilities, the army was directed to enter. where the village was razed after the skirmish occurred, where most were women and children. Riveted bramble of passive verbs etched in wood, stripped hands breaking up from the dry ground to pinch the meat of their young red tongues. I chose to share this poem because it's the kind of poem a teacher might bring into the classroom and wonder how to situate and how to utilize. So I'm going to offer some strategies that connect a poem like this to place. And I would like to model something that Renee talked about earlier, and that is the process of inquiry. So could we advance to the next slide, please? All right. I think of questioning as a form of engagement in education that I use to kind of break down the hierarchy of a learner, a teacher. I know that in Shawnee tradition, a lot of times we learn intergenerationally. So a lot of my learning experiences as a tribal person have been in spaces where children, adults, elders, we're all learning together. And that really helps me think about the way questioning or inquiry can situate some learning within that tradition for me. So when I come to an experience as a teacher or learner, I like to come up with some questions in my mind that help me bring my best spirit forward and be in a place of listening and teaching. So I'd like to share those questions with you. And then we'll have a little bit of time as well to engage and interact with these questions to see what you all think. So here are the questions that I brought to today's learning. The first question is really central. That is, how can we center indigeneity and Indigenous expertise and excellence in all paths to learning? This one's really important to me as a writer and a teacher, because I think that very often in the classroom, what I remember was either erasure, so not learning about tribal history, Shawnee history, or Indigeneity at all. Or I was learning about it from this very deficit perspective, where it was either a tragic history, or it was used as a counter narrative to the dominant narrative. So I like to bring this sense that Indigenous expertise is very real and important, and Indigenous excellence is a part of our living tradition. So when I talk about Indigenous poetry, I see it as important for all learners and all students. Another key question for our time tonight is, how do we center place as primary conceptual foundation for all learning? That is something very new, I think, in the classroom, but not new in the Indigenous framing of how we pass on knowledge and education. Finally, how can we empower the learner to root a personal path of learning within the legacy of family and community? And I think what I mean by that is, how do we in the classroom assure that we are honoring the learning traditions that all students are coming from? So these are the questions that I'm bringing into our space tonight. And one of the things that I hope to do at the end is be able to reflect and kind of see if I was accountable to these intentions. I think we can actually advance the slide now. And one of the ways that I think folks can engage with or think about some of these questions to frame learning and teaching is to just kind of think about them. So I'm going to invite everyone to use the chat. Of course, this is voluntary, so please do feel comfortable in your space. These are questions that you can think about in your mind, or do feel free to participate in the chat. It's really engaging. But here's some examples that you might respond to in the chat. How is land connected to literature? How often does place come up in the classroom as a concept? And do students feel connected as learners to the land they learn on? So feel free to take a moment, think about one or all of these questions, And if you are so inclined, do populate your answers into the chat so we can see how people are feeling. Additionally, I would invite folks, if you have a question that's come up in your mind that you'd like to kind of share just as thinking, as inquiry model, feel free to do that as well. But we'll hold a minute or two for folks to chat what they think about these questions. And we've got some really captivating and interesting ideas coming up, thinking about connection to land, connection to place. So do give yourselves a chance to look in the chat if you haven't yet, because we've got some folks making direct connections to the land they're on, ideas for how to make these connections. It looks like for curriculum, for story setting, these are fantastic. And I love that one thing that's happening in the chat is connections between place and language. So the way that place actually informs language, modes of speaking, really interesting. Right, so thank you folks for these interesting ideas in the chat. Feel free to keep populating it up. But what I'd like to do next is I'm going to share a strategy that I think brings all of these ideas together. And it's a strategy that I hope will be useful in a lot of different contexts. So as I mentioned, I really hold dear the way that Shawnee education is very intergenerational. So I would encourage folks to think about the strategy that I'm about to share for lots of different age groups, lots of different kind of disciplines of study. I've used this strategy with really young children to talk out an idea, and I've used it with folks who are in graduate school for poetry. So I want to embrace that adaptability, that multi-generational model. So I think we could go ahead and advance to the next slide. All right, so what I'm going to share with you now is a strategy that uses place to open doors to talk about poetry and literature. And one thing I'd like to do before I jump into this strategy is tell you where the impulse came from for me. So Renee mentioned that we are Shawnee people and we are the descendants of a violent removal. Our tribe, the Eastern Shawnee tribe, now we often get the chance to go back to our homelands in the Scioto Valley in Ohio. And it's a very powerful experience. And I went back, oh gosh, a good decade ago now. And one thing that really changed the way that I look at teaching and writing was we had an elder and he talked about how in Shawnee story keeping tradition, you look to the land to unlock pieces of story. And he said how it had been so many generations since we had been upon the land in our original homeland, but it still unlocked a story to look to a particular landscape. And I really thought that that was one of the most powerful and beautiful ways of thinking about literature and thinking about how, as people, story, image, narrative is connected to place. And I thought, my goodness, how often in the classroom do we separate place from literature and decontextualize how all story comes from land? And coming back to that more traditional knowledge was really powerful for me as a writer. And I wanted to bring it into the classroom and just know that it would be powerful for students too. So that's the impulse of this strategy, is kind of taking that knowledge and bringing it into the classroom. I'm going to utilize some of the same vocabulary that we talked about when we analyzed the beaded shoulder bag. And that's looking, noticing, connecting, and wondering. Now, in this case, we're going to be looking, noticing, connecting, and wondering about land to organize ideas. A guiding question for this is, how can we honor and center place and worldview in teaching literacy? So in this case, we've read a poem, right? And now I imagine we're in the classroom, perhaps we're in the library setting, and we've read this poem, and now how do we get to understanding it? Traditionally, we might have a worksheet with key questions. There might be an outline to fill out. We might have a class dialogue where the teacher asks guiding questions. Now, those are all perspectives, but I'd like to offer a different one. So here's this perspective. First, this strategy works really well for considering big ideas and noticing details in literature and writing by noticing place and connecting to land. So that's often our goal in teaching, right? Is to think about the big ideas and notice the details and make connections. So the way this works, you read a poem, just like we just did, and notice any connections to land and place. So the connections could come directly from the poem. It could be that the poem has mentioned particular places, or the connection can actually come from the reader. The reader could even talk about how, I've read this poem and it reminds me of this river because of the sounds, or I'm looking out the window as I've listened to it, so this mountain that's in my view is in my mind. All land is important. All connections are valid. So this opens that kind of space for abundance and understanding and thinking about literature and poetry. Next, we would talk about how the text connects to place and make some of those contextual connections. What I love to do, both as a poet and a teacher at this point, is pick a landform. So talk about an actual landform. Maybe it occurs within the poetry. Maybe it's a landform that we are living on or learning on. It could be adjacent to the school. But things like where I am in the Pacific Northwest, a mountain or a river that we can use as a structure or outline to better track thinking and understand ideas. This landform, again, it could come from the text or it could be symbolic. So what I do in the classroom is, once we've found or identified a landform, we'd look at it, talk about and notice its shape. I'm going to model this in the next slide in just a moment, and talk about how students have used the poem that I read to utilize shape and landform. Once we have this common landform, it becomes the basis for an outline. And I just use the word outline as a way that now we have a common visual to talk about the poem. This is a great time to add details, opinions, research, new ideas in the shape of the landform, and connect to ways the shape guides and unlocks new thinking, ideas, and organizational structures. So all the things that a teacher might hope to do with a more traditional handout can occur with all of these open pathways of place and land. I would encourage folks who try this out to kind of notice and encourage students to notice that as readers and writers, talkers and thinkers, it may feel different to write up a mountain and then down a river. It could feel different to write across the desert landscape of a poem than a snowy place. And those things are really rich noticings to see, how does place impact how we think and tell a story. Notice patterns that different landforms invite into the process and allow your mind to wonder. So this, I think, is a really powerful way to emphasize that as people, we learn from the land and our stories are deeply connected to the land. Additionally, I talked in my questioning about how one of my goals as a teacher is to really honor the traditions that students come from. And traditions tend to be place-based. So I think opening this space of thinking about poetry or literature, thinking about writing through the land is a way to have students feel that what they are learning in the classroom is connected to the traditions and habits of story keeping and image that they have in their home as well. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. And I wanted to share, here are some of the ways that this has come up in terms of prompting and looking at land using the poem that we read. So I want to just kind of model this for you, and then I'll be giving you a chance to talk some of these ideas out in the chat. So using this strategy of looking, noticing, connecting, and wondering about land to organize ideas, some of the questions that are connected to the poem Passive Voice are: look at the poem and see if it brings any landforms or places into your mind. Notice any patterns, places, remarkable details, or moments of surprise. What ideas or places do you connect to this poem? And what do you wonder about the poem? What questions does it leave in your mind? So this is an example of how I might prompt this routine. And if we advance the slide again, I'd like to share a visual of what this looks like. So this is a student example. And I just want to note how students can utilize this strategy to get to some really deep and connected thinking about the poem. So as I said, this is a fairly dense poem. It's also, of all my poems, one of the most widely taught. So I get the chance to get a lot of feedback because this poem appears in lots of schools, particularly lots of colleges. And it does ask a lot of the reader because things are happening with the language and the place. And this particular student example, this comes from an 8th grade classroom. So this is sort of like an early adolescent thinker. And I'd like just to kind of show some of the way that this unlocked what I saw as some incredibly sophisticated thinking and some very open access points. So what these students came up with for the land feature comes from the citation of Yellowstone or Yosemite. And one of the students talked in class and said, well, I know that Yellowstone has this geyser, and the class decided geyser was a great landform to use. So this visual is of a geyser. And it got the class really talking about how the poem shows what's under the surface and what kind of blows through the historical record. Some of the things that I thought were really interesting is that it says, like the zombie image, the true history cannot stay buried. And I remember in this particular class example, this opened us to a really incredible connected discussion around the national park system and how many national parks are actually sacred sites to Indigenous people, and that historically the formation of the national park system was very much interwoven with the Allotment Act and the removal of tribal people from tribal land. So I was really taken with how using a land feature could really engage a lot more students in much more kind of interesting and connected thinking, and how fundamentally it showed that this story of the poem is completely connected to the land that it refers to, which I think is a really powerful part of poetry. So we'll go ahead and advance the slide. And I'd like to give folks a chance to think about some of these ideas in the chat. So what we've done, just to kind of keep things a little exciting, is this is an invitation. elementary teachers, middle school teachers, high school teachers, and all other teachers and learners, we're going to invite you to respond to one of the questions. Of course, if you see a question that you really want to respond to and it doesn't correspond with that identity, no worries. Please feel free to respond to any question you like. But elementary teachers, look at the poem and see if it brings any landforms or places into your mind. So feel free in the chat if you are so inclined to try this out a little bit just to see how it feels. Middle school teachers, notice any patterns, places, remarkable details, or moments of surprise. High school teachers, what ideas or places do you connect to this poem? And any other teachers or learners, what do you wonder about the poem? What questions does it leave in your mind? So feel free to engage with the chat. Feel free as well to, if you have any other insights from what has just been shared and you'd like to kind of get them out into the world, this is a great time for that as well. But we'll hold a minute or two for folks to kind of think and put their ideas in the chat. And for folks who haven't read the chat yet, another link to that poem was just made available. So do feel free to access that link if it's useful to you. We've got some interesting ideas coming up in the chat. And one thing that I find so important and interesting is that folks are connecting to places from the poem, but additionally, folks are connecting to other places, which I think is so important, that this is not a static outcome-driven question. Sometimes I think reading a poem and connecting it to the place you're on, connecting it to a particular place in the mind is very, very powerful. So I have to say, I'm really pleased to see that there's folks who are actually making connections that are sort of conceptual to other places. To me, that's a really powerful literacy strategy and something that in the classroom is a way that can invite access and a way that can invite discussion. So really powerful to see that. And thank you for kind of the vulnerability of sharing those things as well. So before we move on, the other thing that I want to call attention to that's happening in the chat is a lot of folks are finding that this questioning is bringing forth these incredible images. So it's almost like poetic stanzas are happening in the chat. And that's another point that I think is really kind of important to surface, that this connection to place can also be really powerful in creating and encouraging new writing, and even kind of showing that when we read poetry and create poetry, that impulse of taking in story and image and then producing new story and image is really powerful. So I love that if we read this chat, it would almost be like stanzas of poetry. Thank you so much, folks, for your engagement and these really interesting kind of connections to place. What I'd like to do now is let's go ahead and advance the screen. And this kind of leads into something that I really like to do as a writer and a teacher, just to acknowledge that thinking about something in a new way, particularly something that you might then offer up as an instructor to learners, it does take a lot of courage, and it also takes effort. So there's cognitive effort, there's the vulnerability of trying something new. And I think that very often teachers and knowledge keepers, language instructors do a lot of care for community. But I think that there are places to fold in some self-care as well. So I want to acknowledge this hard work before we go on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about resources that you can bring into your classroom. And hopefully we'll have some time for further discussion and questions as well. But this is important, I think, to take a little time to be able to honor yourself. And this is something I do a lot as a reader, a writer, and a teacher. So I'm going to invite you to just take a little pause, having learned this new strategy, participated in this thinking. And you can participate by, you can write this in the chat if you're comfortable and like to, or this can just be for you. You can write it on your own. But here's what I'd like to just offer. I always think of thinking of something new as kind of bringing a particular warmth or cool to the mind. So end with an indication of how you feel right now. You could feel really excited, kind of like a warm feeling, really wanting to take this into the classroom, or you might feel a little overwhelmed or unclear, maybe that kind of cool feeling of backing away. All feelings are good. And there's no one way to engage with writing in place. So give yourself a moment to think about, how do you feel right now? And once you have a sense of how you feel, I want to invite you to imagine a form of warmth or cool, whatever you need. If you need something to cool you off mentally, you could think of something kind of like a blanket in the shade, or the way the weather changes when you walk from sun to cloud cover. If you want something to kind of warm you up and inspire you, I always think of different kind of warm things, a cup of coffee in your hands, or the warmth on your hair of the sun. And just let that kind of seep into your writing. Give yourself a little warmth or cool, whatever you need. And we'll just take a minute to let you kind of end in this space of acknowledging that you've engaged with this new idea, thought about places, read and analyzed a fairly dense and pretty powerful poem about history of place. So give yourself a little warmth or cool, and then we'll get a chance to talk about some resources that you can bring to your learning spaces. All right, folks, some beautiful images of warmth coming up. Thank you for participating in this. I think it's really important that if you are engaging in the learning process, take a little bit of time to be able to give yourself some warmth or cool the things that you need. What I'd like to do now is offer some resources. And this is where we're going to actually connect to Joy Harjo's project and give you all some really fantastic resources that you can bring into the classroom to use this strategy with. So thank you once more for participating in this self-care. And let's go ahead and advance the slide. All right, so there's a very logical progression of, if you've learned through this strategy and thought maybe you'd like to use it in your learning environment, one of the things that you'll want is some poetry to bring in and some Indigenous poetry to highlight. So I want to invite you to, in the chat, if you can name an Indigenous poet that you use in your classroom, that would be a fantastic resource for all of us. So feel free to name an Indigenous or woman poet that you use in the classroom. If you don't know or have one, that's okay. That's what we're going to actually address next. But if you do, please do feel free. And fiction writers are fantastic as well. I can see Leslie Marmon Silko, Tommy Orange coming up. Yeah, any kind of writing is fantastic. All right, folks, we've got some great writers, some great ideas coming up. All right, so what I'd like to do is I'm going to briefly share a resource that you can use in your learning spaces. It's really a fantastic public resource. So if we could go ahead and advance the slide. So I'm going to talk about a resource available from our poet laureate, Joy Harjo. And this is through the Library of Congress. Joy Harjo is an incredible poet. I see a few of you mentioned her in the chat, so that's just fantastic. And she is our poet laureate until right now, and her tenure has been really historic. So she's had a third term, which is incredibly remarkable, and was our first Indigenous poet laureate, and also a really incredible poet, but an incredible teacher and leader in the Indigenous poetry and writing community. So this is Joy Harjo's project. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. And it's called Living Nations, Living Words. And this is a story map of Indigenous poets, and each poet is kind of placed upon the map. So it's already really closely connected to this analysis and contextual building by place. Many poets chose their tribal or ancestral homelands, and then some poets chose where they live and work. So you can see poets from all over different tribal nations, all over the map itself. This was a really incredible project. I am talking about it now, but I was also a participant in this project. So I'm listed on this story map, but it is full of really incredible poems, and many of the folks that you just mentioned in the chat are actually featured on this as well. So go ahead and advance the slide. And this is an image of Living Nations, Living Words. This is available online. It is also available as a print anthology, so you can actually get this as a book as well, but very accessible online for classrooms. And let's go ahead and advance the slide one more time. And this is just a visual to show how you can see that you can actually locate different Indigenous poets on the map itself. So I think a really powerful resource for teaching Indigenous poetry in connection to land. So yes, please do give that a look. It's an incredible resource for the classroom or any learning space. All right.
Hi, Laura and everyone. Thank you so much for sharing it. I was furiously taking notes, and I'm really looking forward to going back to the recording and just spending more time with some of these ideas. I really feel like it gave me some of just the phrases that you use, the way that you articulate some of your ideas are just very, I think, helpful and just very welcoming and inviting. And so I really appreciate all that you shared with us today. And there is a really good question in the question and answer. I think, I'd love to take a moment, if you could, to answer the question. It says, how do you have any strategies to make students care? Are there any sort of dynamic exercises that involve students physically and emotionally, not just intellectually? And I feel like, to me, when I heard that, I thought of the self-care that you just did. That sort of, I think, pulls out kind of checking in with people emotionally. But I wonder if you can add a little bit to how we can make our students care more, maybe about the history of place and those types of things.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that one of the ways that I frame it in my mind, and I hope this doesn't sound dismissive because it's not, this is the most important kind of trust that has to occur in a learning community, is that one of the ways we make students care is we have to care about them. And we also have to center them in the hierarchy of learning. So I do think that a lot of students, and in my experience, this has happened with a lot of Indigenous students too. Once I see a young learner who's in 9th grade and they have been through a school system that is disconnected from their traditions of really excellence and beauty and thinking, it can be, I think, really painful. So sometimes by that time, if you put an activity in front of the student, you're dealing with some trauma. And one of the ways I think to kind of make a student care is learn about the student, but also provide alternate ways that a student in your classroom can achieve success, positivity. And sometimes one of the most powerful ways is make it look and feel really different. So if a paper on the desk has for 8 years meant failure or stress, engage with poetry in a completely different way. That's why I think a visual engagement point is really powerful. I also think kind of opening access to what is story and image, because poetry is beautiful and powerful, and poetry comes out of multiple traditions. So thinking about what does a student think of as rhythmic or as symbolic. And, the last thing I think that is important to me is come to your students with a mind frame of abundance. Because if a student, for example, let's say they use this activity with the poem and they just kind of focus on one tiny part, just want to do one piece of, like, they just want to draw the geyser, for example. Well, that is a really important access point, and maybe kind of valuing that as looking really closely is a great place to begin to encourage kind of a drawing out of conversation. So yeah, I think that offering multiple access points, coming at the task with a different sense of what is expected, are really powerful ways. And then, of course, trust comes over time in the classroom. So I think just relationship building. And then often, what it is to care can look different to different people. So maybe giving students lots of opportunities to care in different ways that might not look the same is also pretty powerful. But that's a great question and very real.
You touched on, abundance earlier, and I just think it's such a powerful and inviting way to, reframe thinking. And I love this idea that you mentioned, and I think it really resonates. And what we've hoped to do with this series, which is find multiple access points, to share some of these key concepts. So, and I also really appreciate how you talked about that there, change our expectations maybe, or make things look different. I imagine maybe students being outside and it just spending more time actually, listening to the water of, and those kinds of things become really important too. So thank you for sharing. I think that was a great question and a really helpful answer. Everybody, that I just wanted to mention, in addition to this wonderful resource that Laura has shared with us, this is a cover of a book, When the Rain Sings, and it's poetry by young Native kids. And they actually looked through our collection and found objects in the collection, our collection we're caring for, and they're really, their collections. And so they use those as an area of inspiration, and then create a poetry from that. So I share that and invite you to also look that book up, and maybe open some conversations with your students about that and connect with other youth voices. So I want to again thank you so much, Laura, for all that you've shared with us today. It's been so I don't know, it's kind of ranged really far, but it also leaves me with a real curiosity to go deeper and to look back and to see the recording and try some of the strategies that you shared with us. So thank you very much for sharing all of that. I wanted to just share on the next slide a little bit about, and everybody's saying, yeah, thank you for this gift, about some programs that we have that are upcoming. Tomorrow, in fact, Indigenous Youth Poet Warriors, one of our Youth in Action programs, will be available on demand for free. So that's available on our website. We also have a professional development, and it's focused for New York teachers primarily, but if you're from New York and you're not registered already, it is American Indian, it's called Native New York, American Indians, and Dutch New Amsterdam. So that is available, and we're happy to share more information. That is on our upcoming webinars under professional development. And again, I want to say Niawe. Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing with us. It's been such a delight to spend time with you and with all of the teachers here, for sharing ideas and just getting us to think in new and deep ways. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to working with you again in the future. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.